Welcome, friends, to this webinar, Queer and Catholic, Making Sense of the Recent and Confusing Catholic Statements on LGBTQ Issues. I am Mark Bowman, Executive Director of the LGBTQ Religious Archives Network, which is co-hosting tonight's program with the Center for LGBTQ and Gender Studies in Religion. CLGS works to advance the well-being of LGBTQ people and to transform faith communities and the wider society by taking a leading role in shaping a new public discourse on religion, gender identity, and sexuality through education, research, community building, and advocacy. CLGS is based at the Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, California. LGBTQ-RAN is a unique venture dedicated to preserving the history of LGBTQ+ religious movements around the world. LGBTQ-RAN is a digital enterprise. We are not a physical repository that stores papers. We advise and support leaders and groups in their efforts to preserve their records in appropriate archives. Furthermore, we collect and provide a treasure of historical information on our website about LGBTQ+ persons and groups from a wide array of religious expressions around the world. And finally, we encourage research and scholarship in queer religious history. Tonight, CLGS Executive Director Bernard Schlager will facilitate a discussion with Marianne Duddy-Burke and Ruiz that will explore and try to make sense of recent statements by Roman Catholic leaders on homosexuality, transgender persons, and same-sex relationships. While on the one hand, Pope Francis has made some positive statements regarding queer people and relationships, he has also, on the other hand, disparaged transgender persons and identities. How is one to understand and respond to what many see as a confusing series of recent statements by church officials? And do such statements make a real difference in the lives of queer Catholics? Our presenters tonight, first, Bernard Schlager, Ph.D., is Associate Professor of Historical and Cultural Studies and Executive Director at the Center for LGBTQ and Gender Studies in Religion. He received his Ph.D. from Yale University in the history of medieval and Latin American Christianity, and he has taught at the University of New Hampshire, Trinity College, Middlebury College, the Graduate Theological Union, and Yale. Schlager's research interests and publications are in the areas of queer studies, the history of Christianity, LGBTQ pastoral care, and medieval social and religious history. Marianne Duddy-Burke is Executive Director of Dignity USA, the world's oldest organization of Catholics committed to justice, equality, and full inclusion for LGBTQIA+ people in our church and society. She has also served as Dignity USA's president and was the first woman ever elected to that post. Marianne is also co-chair of the Global Network of Rainbow Catholics. She holds a Master's of Divinity degree from Weston Jesuit School of Theology. Our third presenter, Ruiz, Ph.D., is the incoming Assistant Professor of Latinx and Queer Decolonial Theology at the Pacific School of Religion. He currently serves as a postdoctoral fellow of Catholic Studies at Candler School of Theology. He holds a Ph.D. in Theology and Ethics from the Graduate Theological Union. Ish's upcoming book on LGBTQ+ educators in Catholic schools, which will be released this fall, reflects his research interests at the intersection of LGBTQ+ inclusion, queer theology, Catholic theological ethics, education, and social justice. To those of you watching this webinar, we welcome your comments or questions in the chat box or the Q&A functions. The presenters will respond to those during the Q&A time toward the end of tonight's program. If you would like to offer personal greetings or comments to the presenters, stay on after the webinar has concluded, and you will be invited into the Zoom room with them. Please direct any technical concerns to Riot Mueller, who is the tech manager for this program. Now, it is my pleasure to welcome Bernard Schlager, Marianne Duddy-Burke, and Ruiz to this queer and Catholic conversation.
Thanks so much, Mark. CLGS is really honored to be presenting this with LGBTQ Religious Archives Network and with Dignity USA. So as Marianne and Ish and I strategized last week, the program schedule we came up, being mindful of time, we're working within an hour, is for each of us to present a bit, several minutes, and then entertain questions among ourselves, a brief discussion, and then respond to any questions or comments that you have. So I will begin, and I'm mindful of my 7-minute timeline here. Again, as Mark mentioned, my background is in history, and I want to just place myself in this discussion by saying I'm a cis white male, I'm a gay man who is Roman Catholic. And I want to say just a little bit about my place as a Roman Catholic. I come from a progressive Catholic family. My experience in ministry is as a church musician for many years. I haven't done that for quite a while. I want to emphasize I am not a theologian or a pastoral care minister within the church. The place where I have found my place within the Catholic Church these days is the member of a local parish. I have had a difficult relationship, I guess, with the church, and maybe see myself as very much on the margins of the church, although participating in it in the best way I can. And so what I'd like to do here is, obviously we won't run through the entire history of Roman Catholicism and sexuality, but I want to mention a few things that I think are germane to our discussion. And of course, I'm picking and choosing a few things. But as Mark said, what do we make of recent and very confusing, even sometimes contradictory statements? So let me begin here with my piece of it by sharing my screen. And I have a brief PowerPoint I'd like to, can you see that, hopefully? Great. So as I begin this discussion, I want to emphasize that my understanding of church, as is probably true of many of you, is a very broad understanding. And I'm thinking back 50 years to someone like Avery Dulles and others since then, of course, who have proposed various ways of thinking about the church. Is the Catholic Church an institution? Obviously, it is. But it's also a servant community. It's a community of people who follow Jesus in the best way that we can. Dulles also spoke about it, the church as a herald, as a sacrament. So I have a very broad understanding of church. And even though the Vatican speaks loudly, sometimes clearly, most often not very clearly, and many people interpret Catholicism as church leaders and the male hierarchy, my understanding, my place of engagement with the church is in other areas, even though there is the reality, of course, of the hierarchy. And I'm going to begin with that faithful and awful statement that appeared in the Catechism of the Catholic Church in 1992. When I mentioned this to some friends the other day, they said, "Why would you drag this up?" I drag it up because it is a part of the teaching of the church, this very harmful statement. And it seems apparent to me, and as many people have commented, official Catholic statements seem to almost always interpret any understanding of queer identities, of trans identities, of what it means to live and breathe and act and live and love and be a sexual being as a queer person, LGBTQIA+ within the church, seems to always be interpreted in these official documents through this archaic concept of homosexuality. Let me just read it, if I might. So it is interesting, of course, that as many of you know, the placement of this statement on homosexuality comes under a section of the Catechism listed as the vocation to chastity. But it comes after a long list of offenses against chastity, including lust, masturbation, fornication, pornography, prostitution, rape, and then this statement, 2357. So homosexuality refers to relations between men or between women who experience, move my screen around here, an exclusive or predominant sexual attraction toward persons of the same sex. It has taken a variety of forms throughout the centuries, to say the least, and in different cultures. Its psychological genesis remains largely unexplained, according to this document, basing itself on sacred scripture, which in their reading presents homosexual acts as acts of grave depravity. Tradition has always declared that homosexual acts are intrinsically disordered. As a historian, I would venture my opinion and the opinion of others that that is not true, but nevertheless, so these acts are contrary to the natural law. They close the sexual act to the gift of life. They do not proceed from a genuine affective and sexual complementarity. Under no circumstances can they be approved. So that is, to say the least, a harsh statement. I remember in 1986 when that was floated before the 1992 publishing of the Catechism under John Paul II, and it has rung loudly in the ears of many people. And the reason we're talking about confusion is that we know Pope Francis has issued some statements and made some pastoral moves on queer people and issues that are decidedly mixed, right? Beginning in July of 2013, rather, not long after he became Pope, said, "Who am I to judge a gay person of goodwill who seeks the Lord? You can't marginalize these people." In October 2020, there was a papal approval of civil unions, which we were told very clearly are not to be understood in any way as equivalent to sacramental marriage. 2023, an approval of baptism of transgender people, and that trans people could be godparents. And again, I'm not a theologian, but I'm trying to just kind of lay a groundwork here or some sort of framework for Marianne and Ish as they enter into the conversation. In this fiducia supplicans, supplicating trust, the Pope approved blessing of same-sex couples. Again, we were warned it is not akin in any way to sacramental marriage. And then as some sort of response, this infinite dignity, dignitas infinita, was issued. And so looking a bit at this, so in April of this year, the Vatican's Dicastery for the Doctrine of Faith, and approved by the Pope, it reaffirmed traditional Catholic teachings on abortion, euthanasia, and assisted suicide, and added the following violations of human dignity. And it's been described by many as the first authoritative statement from the Vatican on transgender persons. So it talks about poverty, war, the trafficking of migrants, sexual abuse, violence against women, abortion, surrogacy, euthanasia, marginal with disabilities. Surprisingly, digital violence makes an appearance here. And then it talks about gender theory, gender fluidity, and sex change. And so the reason I mention that document is it has been maligned by most theologians I have read, many people working in pastoral fields within the church, and by others. And it is a document that has been stunning in its lack of depth. There's some people in the chat room here I see who have written on it. In many ways, the sloppy way in which it was put together, and the very harmful ramifications of a document. And again, as I close out my comments here, and before I turn it over to Marianne, it seems to me, as we think about this historically, the overriding concept that is used is homosexuality, as it is understood in that document and in the Catechism. And the myriad of queer identities and queer sexualities disappear, it seems, under this condemnation of homosexuality. As we know, it's often typical in Vatican documents, there is any lack of input from LGBTQ plus individuals themselves. Certainly in this last document, no women, no transgender persons. Decidedly negative framework based upon the supposition, many have written about this, in Catholic documents that queer people and queer experiences are sinners and sinful. And then let me close with the interesting but confusing press that this Pope gets. And just a few days ago, it seems, the Washington Post made mention of the fact that the Pope has a personal outreach to some trans people who are sex workers. And the reason I want to close with that is the confusing nature of being a queer Catholic, being an LGBTQ plus Catholic, is on the one hand dealing with the institution of the church, the teaching authority of the church that is restricted often to Vatican documents, that once again do not include the experience of LGBTQ plus individuals, our lives, our loves, our families, viewed through a lens of sin and sinfulness and identities of sinner. And yes, so I'm going to leave it there and turn the microphone, as it were, open to Marianne.
Oh, thank you for that very quick overview. And obviously, there's much more that could be said. Hi, everybody, and thanks for being here. To give you a little bit of my Catholic pedigree, I am a cradle Catholic, went through Catholic school all the way to college and then to a Jesuit seminary. I identify as a cisgender, married, lesbian Catholic mom and as an activist theologian. My spouse and I have been together 30 years as of Easter night. How Catholic is that? Meeting at church on Easter. And we had a sacramental marriage 25 years ago last fall. I find my support and challenge for my Catholic identity in the intentional Eucharistic communities of Dignity, and particularly Dignity Boston, which has been my home community since 1982. For me, any contact with institutional Catholicism is really limited to family occasions like baptisms, first communions, confirmations, or funerals. And honestly, for the last decade plus, I would say that it has been pretty much limited to funerals as more and more of the younger parts of my family disaffiliate with institutional Catholicism. So Bernie's laid out some of the Vatican focus here that has brought us together, and I'd just like to add some more of the Catholic voices that further complicate this landscape that we're talking about, because as Bernie said, the church has multiple ways of being in the world. So think about these few things. So in 2023, about 30 communities of women religious marked Transgender Day of Visibility with a statement of affirmation, and many communities offer annual Pride services. At the same time, that a significant group of U.S. Catholic bishops is working to ban all gender-affirming care at all Catholic hospitals and healthcare facilities, which would impact 1 in 6 Americans. And many Catholic schools prohibit any kind of support for trans or non-binary students, even the simple thing of calling people by their chosen names. Long before Fiducia Supplicans was published, bishops in many German-speaking parts of the church had developed protocols and rites for blessing same-sex couples. Even as their brother bishops and some leading Catholic politicians in several African nations were leading efforts to pass or toughen laws criminalizing homosexuality or expression of gender identity that was inconsistent with biological sex. We continue to see the terminations of LGBTQIA plus people and outspoken ally employees and volunteers at Catholic institutions for marrying, for living their true gender identity, for expressing public support of their queer kids, despite the fact that most Catholics believe that this is unjust and wrong. Publications like Commonweal, the National Catholic Reporter, and U.S. Catholics have all cited official church teachings on gender identity and sexual orientation, along with issues of women's equality and the response to decades of child sexual abuse by priests and the cover-up by the bishops, as the top reasons for the rapidly escalating disaffiliation of Catholics, especially young Catholics, from the Church of our baptism. And then the Vatican documenting and publicizing Pope Francis's meetings with leaders of New Ways Ministry, Outreach, and the global network of Rainbow Catholics, including myself, during the synod, which had no openly queer representation, and as they were drafting a final report that failed to include any explicit mention of LGBTQ plus issues, despite passionate discussion throughout the gathering. So the list goes on, but I'm just pointing to a landscape that is riddled with landmines. This is causing confusion and danger, rooted in church leaders wanting to have cake and eat it too. I believe that the fundamental dilemma created, perpetrated, and sustained by much of the clerical class is the fantasy that they can be good pastors while upholding dogma that prohibits affirming and serving people in the fullness of our humanity. The tension between wanting to welcome and accompany LGBTQIA plus people and our loved ones, and insisting that church teaching is immutable, is unresolvable. You simply can't teach that queer people are intrinsically flawed humans who can only live into the divine plan by renouncing our essence and genuinely affirm and welcome us. So what we're seeing now is the inevitable results of the failure of the institutional church to make a clear choice. This failure results in traumatizing LGBTQIA plus people and those who love us by offering hope and then dashing it, sometimes repeatedly. It makes frontline ministers unsure of how freely they may serve. To what extent can they respond with what they believe to be good pastoral care? And at what point do they risk their ministry, their livelihood, their identity being stripped from them? This conflict restricts many from living an abundant life and robs the world of gifts that otherwise would be freely given. The people of the Catholic Church have realized the failure of leadership and are making choices about how they want to deal with it. Some Catholics, and I thank God that it's a declining number, firmly adhere to the official teachings on gender identity and sexual orientation. These may be the bakers or web designers who refuse their talents for same-sex weddings, or, more frighteningly, hospital workers who claim religious or moral objections to serving certain patients or providing certain services. Many simply disregard church teaching. The declaration that priests can now offer a spontaneous blessing for same-sex couples was met by many LGBT people with indifference. We already knew the blessing of our sexuality and relationships in the core of our being, and most of our loved ones did as well. Roughly 70% of U.S. Catholics, according to most polls, support equal civil rights protections for LGBTQIA plus people, see a variety of sexual orientations and gender identities as natural variations among humanity, and do not believe that being queer is morally transgressive or sinful. And this is as true for people who attend Mass. This is true for people who attend Mass often, and for those who identify as Catholic but no longer practice their faith regularly. Given these realities, why do documents like the ones we're considering still matter? First, while most of the responses that I saw to Fiducia Supplicans, the blessing of same-sex couples, was indifference, there were others, particularly but not exclusively those I know through my global network of Rainbow Catholics work, who reported that this declaration removed a barrier to full affirmation from parents, grandparents, siblings, friends, healing tensions and rifts that have been very painful. So this pastoral impact is important. Even more so, while its power is in decline in many places, the Catholic Church still wields tremendous impact in the lives of the 8.1 billion people on planet Earth. And this power disproportionately impacts the lives of the impoverished and the marginalized. Our church runs the largest private educational network, the largest healthcare system, and the largest social services program on earth. Catholics are overrepresented among government officials in many countries. So the kinds of policies that flow from the worldview embedded in these documents impacts how people, whether Catholic or not, are educated, cared for, and live all over the world. They decrease the access to the very things that lead to abundant life. They reinforce laws and social structures that marginalize people and can even be seen as justifying violence and criminalization. So this is why those of us who still identify as Catholic in any way must not only believe in the wholeness and equality of LGBTQIA plus people, but must become advocates propelled by our faith. I'd now like to hear from my colleague, Dr. Ish Ruiz.
Thank you, Marianne, and thank you, Bernie. And thank you all for joining us. My name is Ish Ruiz. I am a Catholic theologian. I also was born and raised Catholic. I'm originally from San Juan, Puerto Rico. Attended school in the States and found myself as a gay Catholic school educator for many years, wrestling, synthesizing a Catholic identity with queer identity in a place that would fire me should I make these identities known. Or the synthesis known, I should say. And that drove me into academic studies to further explore how one could precisely synthesize that. But more importantly, how can Catholics contribute to a church that is precisely more welcoming of LGBTQ plus persons and why that is important. And I echo everything that's been said before about the pain, the hurt, but also the importance of this conversation, despite it being a painful one. My remarks today, I have one overarching question, and it kind of breaks into three smaller questions, and it's a rhetorical question. The question is, are we serious about who we say we are as a Catholic Church? That's the question I have. And it has three smaller questions. The first one is, are we serious about synodality? And synodality is important because to me, it really frames this conversation going forward. I shake and tremble when I think about what's going to happen after Pope Francis. But at the same time, I place my hope in the future of our church in his model of synodality, which I consider to be a new ecclesiology, a new way of being in the church, where people walk together as a community guided by the Holy Spirit. And I can offer a lot of insights about this, but there is this one quote that is my favorite quote about synodality, and I'm pasting on the chat, and I will read. And it's by Gregor Strelzik, and it says, quote, "In its very essence, synodality is associated with a possibility of an epiphany of the Spirit." In other words, every gathering in which synodality of the church is realized is at least potentially an epiphany of the Holy Spirit. Moreover, expectation of this epiphany should be the reason for such a gathering. And that quote to me captures the beauty of the synodal journey as we're walking together, being guided, and we will be surprised where we end up, okay? And that frames my second question and my third question, which are, second, are we serious about God's revelation? And are we serious about God's revelation being found in the most unlikely of places, right? Pope Francis speaks about this God of surprises, and it sounds beautiful, but are we serious about that? Are we serious about a God who's continuously and continually revealing God's own self through our lives? Okay? The Second Vatican Council has this beautiful teaching on the sense of the faithful, the sensus fidelium, right? And it's this idea that the faithful through our lives serve as conduits of God's revelation. The Spirit is telling us God's own will through our lives, is speaking God's will to us. And you know, and so in this sense, human experience becomes this avenue for revelation. And that revelation is grounded in our baptism. And so when I hear people saying no one takes away our baptism, especially as queer persons, I say, heck yeah, that's true. And not only that, not only does that mean that we belong in this church, but also that our lives are a witness to something that God is communicating in our lives. And when I look at documents like Fiducia Supplicans and Dignitas Infinita, there are some very basic claims being made in these documents, that human beings have dignity and that the church is here to guide and bless people. Very basic claim, but we have not yet as a church admitted that LGBTQ plus persons, by virtue of our baptism, participate in this revelation, okay? And we have what Marianne is talking about, this dichotomy between what we say and how we treat the people who we say something about. Basically, these documents all amount to, let's be very nice to the people we are oppressing, without necessarily taking them seriously. And so that's why I ask, are we serious about God's revelation? Are we afraid of an epiphany that'll take us somewhere that we were not expecting to go? Okay. You know, one of the main critiques of these documents is that precisely they do not listen. They do not reflect the process of listening to the people they are speaking about. And the truth is that when we theologize without listening, we end up, you know, reading the words of an echo chamber and not words that are relevant to the actual lives of persons. And what Marianne is speaking about when she's talking about all of these queer Catholics who are witnesses of faith is precisely the fact that we have ignored a major source of theological insight in our church, which is the lived experience of people who experience same-sex attraction and people who are transgender. LGB, including P, pansexual persons, and transgender persons. And those experiences have not been taken seriously as a source of theological insight. Instead, we wrote these documents that Bernie referenced, and then we reference those documents over and over again. It's called being self-referential, right? This is what I consider is right, and it is right because I already said so earlier, instead of actually taking into account the lived experience of persons. Here is the third question that I have is, are we serious about God's grace? We have this teaching in our church about the natural law, that human beings are already equipped with God's own order, and we are ordered in a particular way, but that order points to something, and it points to human flourishing and happiness. And when I read these documents that say that human beings are disordered or are in a state of sin, as Bernie pointed out, I can't help but ask, have you seen us? Have you taken yourself to a gay bar, to a drag show? You know, I've started to go to these Sunday drag shows. My partner puts on these amazing drag brunches on Sundays. And so they've become a little bit of my new church, and the drag queen has become my new priest. And it's a moment where I experience grace present in queer communities, boundless joy, radical authenticity. And it brings me back to that famous quote from Saint Irenaeus, who says, "The glory of God is human being fully alive." And when LGBTQ plus persons live lives that are fully alive, the glory of God is present. I would also say the grace of God is present. And so in those experiences of queerness, plus in my extensive experiences of ministering to LGBTQ plus persons, I can attest that when queer persons are fully alive, they really are a reflection of the divine. And so when we talk about the Imago Dei, the image of God, the basis of this human dignity, it is precisely found in a life of authenticity and fullness of grace. And those perspectives are certainly missing in the documents that we are referencing, precisely because they appear to be afraid to admit and to acknowledge LGBTQ plus lives as a source of insight. So I conclude with a return to synodality. Synodality is not about welcoming LGBTQ plus persons in the church. Yeah, I mean, I should say not only. That's step one. That's cute. Please welcome us. But it's kind of what Marianne is saying is, I don't need you to tell me that I'm blessed so that I feel blessed. So no, synodality is not about welcome. Synodality is about listening and taking seriously the queer lives that are present in LGBTQ plus witness. It is about seeing those as examples of God's radical love, and about teaching the church what it means to be radically authentic, radically loving in the face of oppression. That is what synodality and queerness are really all about. Queer people, we're not these poor sinners who need help. We're actually quite powerful and quite a beautiful community that has a lot of stuff figured out. There's a lot that we don't have figured out. Just look at my dating life to get an example of that. But there's a lot that we do have figured out. And when we experience love and authenticity and beauty, we really can reflect the divine. And so theologically, I must ask those questions. As a theologian, I must ask the question of where is grace and how is queer grace present in our theology? And as an ethicist, I ask the question, how do queer lives serve as models and virtues for what a Christian life should look like? With that, I will pause our this first portion of our engagement and have open up for some conversation between the three of us before jumping into Q&A.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Ish, and thank you, Marianne. Maybe I'll jump in with a question, since you concluded on the Synod. And as I understand it, the Synod met once last October and will re-meet next October. So how do these documents, like this Fiducia Supplicans, right, and the Infinite Dignity document, how do they relate to what's happening at the Synod, since they seem to be so disconnected? So that's first part of the question. And then second, what are your hopes for next October? Will these documents weigh in critically, or are they just someone's typing up something in the Vatican? And yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that the many folks that are part of the Synod or avid Synod watchers have sort of realized that a lot of what they expected to get accomplished just is not going to happen through that process. I think many folks know that a number of issues, including controversial issues, have been now deferred to working groups that will start meeting this summer and go through next summer, and that the work of the October assembly meeting is now going to be more about process, the kinds of questions Ish was asking about. What does the synodal church look like? And frankly, I have to say, synodality may be new to the folks at the heights of clerical rank, and to many who are trained in a very hierarchical, non-consultative model. But the church has been doing synodality at the grassroots level for decades, if not centuries. We know that. One of the unexpected, perhaps, questions that was asked in the document that was sent out to the church in December, it was called Towards 2024. It invited reflections from groups and faith communities that have lived synodality, base communities, groups like that, to reflect on what that is and to offer models to the church. So I have to say, Dignity took that up. And along with, a report on the next group of listening sessions that we did, we submitted a report to the Synod Secretariat on what it has meant to us as a queer community to live synodal Catholicism for 55 years. And that document is on our website. It's accessible to everybody. It has been sent off to the Synod office, and we actually got a receipt saying that they have it, and we sent it to every Synod delegate from the US that we could, and some of them had actually read it and sent us comments back on it. So, I think if there is a hope for me, it's about engaging across parts of the church and documenting. I think there is going to be a treasure trove of resources, witnesses, and testimonies that come out of this synodal process that really has nothing to do with what's happening over in that hall for 8 weeks total, by the end of it. But it is about people in the church talking to one another.
Yeah, I agree. I think what's interesting about these two documents is that it seems to me like an outsourcing of the conversation. Let's just have these documents and have global conversations and explosions about them without actually engaging meaningfully among the leaders of the church with it. So that's part one of the first question. The second thing is when I see what Pope Francis is doing, he really is trying to change this culture of how the church is a church. It's an ecclesiological question. The Pope could change teaching on homosexuality and gender identity. And by the way, after the publication of Dignitas Infinita, Pope Francis wrote a letter to Jenny Gramick saying that the document is talking about gender ideology, which is different from what he called transsexual persons. And I'm like, yes, that's true. Which is like, a question I have about Bernie. Like, yes, to Bernie, like a lot of people say that it's the first official teaching on transgender persons, but is it? Because to me, it kind of created a boogeyman, which is not who transgender persons are, and then proceeded to attack the boogeyman. And I'm like, you still have not addressed transgender persons. So I do not believe personally that the church has a teaching on transgender persons as of yet, because it doesn't have a teaching of transgender persons as transgender persons understand themselves. With that said, Pope Francis could change the teachings tomorrow, but then what's to stop the next Pope from changing them back? And here we have the polarization and the pendulum swing that I think will be equally stressful for Catholics, for queer Catholics, as our current situation. But if you can change the foundation, the culture of how we are a church together, then perhaps that is more promising to me. That's at least my my take.
Yeah, thank you. I'm mindful of social scientists telling us, or at least they did up until a few years ago, that if fallen away Catholics were a religious denomination, they would be the second largest denomination in the United States. And I only mention that because, as we think about the impact of these statements, and I appreciated, Marianne, what you said about, the huge influence that the Catholic Church still wields in healthcare. Issue been involved in Catholic education for a long time. Frequently, or it used to be said often, that the response of the church was always through pastoral care, right? And that's where the church meets queer people, so to speak. And that's all of a background to say, where do we go from here? The papacy, we live in a church community, right, that as many people have described as a priesthood, a kyriarchal priesthood, right, as Dr. Mary Hunt has said, that tends toward oppression and domination, right, and submission. We know all of that. But where do we go from here? Is it continuing to work? And I'm not denigrating pastoral care and parish life. That's how I connect with it. And is it hoping that someday there will be a change, regardless of what happens with the synod? That the only place of meeting people who want to stay is in pastoral situations.
I'm going to offer a quick response to that, and then I'm going to kind of add a question to Marianne on top of that. The quick response to me is, there's a difference between saying I'm gay versus saying I'm queer. When I'm saying I'm gay, I'm invoking a very stable category. Everyone kind of knows what that is. But when I'm saying I'm queer, I'm invoking a transgressive one. This idea that, like, by being who I am, I'm going to challenge who you are. And so I think that that's how queer people occupy spaces in the church. We don't ask for permission, and we don't need to wait for some documents or some blessings. So in a way, we do very much what Marianne is saying. We exist. We live into a new church. To appropriate a Gandhi quote, we become the church we want to see in the world, right? By being openly and radically, authentically queer. My question to Marianne is, how do we do that when at the same time, like, how do we occupy these spaces, right? Which is what I see Dignity doing, and at the same time cope with the hurt of the exclusion, because it gets really tiring at some point. People experience burnout, and I don't know how you haven't, because I know your story, and I know, like, so I don't know how you haven't. So I wonder if you had kind of a little bit of that practical advice of, like, how we do that.
Yeah, I think those are some of the most fundamental questions. And I really loved the question that you posed at the beginning of your talk, Ish, about, are we serious about who we say that we are? I mean, it's a different way of saying that, be the church, be the world that you want to be, right? Live into the change, go that third way. We are not bound by the rules that are imposed upon us, all of those things. But to me, we are the church. We are the body of Christ, all of us together, and we heal each other. We support each other. We nourish each other. We break and are the bread and wine for one another, and I think that is what keeps us going. And if we are totally serious about being the church and not ceding the church to the hierarchs, that is a radical power. And I see the disaffiliation from institutional Catholicism as actually a hopeful sign, as people taking ownership of their own spirituality, of their own responsibility to live the gospel, if the institution is confining them from doing that, and they are finding new ways to do that, and something new will happen. And if it means the church structure has to crumble for that to happen, well, so be it. But we return to the resurrection, we return to the Pentecost, we return to being the bread and wine and the binding of the wounds for each other.
We have so many examples, right, throughout Christian history, especially in ancient Christianity, for the disobeying of people in positions of religious authority who are disconnected, right, from the lived faith of communities. Now it is time for us to look at some of the Q&A from those of you who have submitted some questions. So I'm going to take a few and share them with our panel. Here's from someone: what do I do about a Catholic Church that has effectively banned me because I am autistic and I don't like their homophobia? I told them that homophobia is not Christian and that God considers all marriages equal because in Christ there is no male or female, just people.
I'm really sorry that happens for you, but we are told shake the dust off your feet. One of the big problems with Catholicism right now is what I call Catholic Incorporated, right? The hierarchs own the brand, but the reality is there are expressions of Catholicism happening all over the place. There are intentional Eucharistic communities. There are Roman Catholic woman priest led communities. There are folks who gather in house churches, women church communities. Reach out to one of us and let us help you get connected with a place that will find space for you. They don't exist everywhere, unfortunately, but if not, maybe you can help get one started.
And I do believe that Dignity USA and New Ways Ministry will post LGBTQ friendly, affirming, welcoming parishes, right?
New Ways Ministry does that, and there are also lots of other groups that post, LGBTQ friendly communities across denominations. MCC churches are filled with a lot of former, folks who no longer practice institutional Catholicism. Episcopal churches are. There's lots of folks, lots of places. But everybody's spiritual journey needs to be respected. So finding a place where it's right for you to get both support and challenge is really important.
Thank you. And I'll read something from the chat. Sorry, I have a little trouble staying in the same place here. For the first time, my parish is forming a prayer group for LGBTQ plus community, their family and friends. I will be the facilitator. The parishioners are largely Latine. I believe they bring a unique experience and I've lost the rest of that. Thank you for that comment. And
they have a unique experience to being LGBTQ plus in contrast to what I know about the dominant U.S. culture. I would like to create as safe an environment as possible and encourage the experience of the Imago Dei within each one and the celebration of the Spirit that speaks to the rest of the church through them. Can you give me any advice as I undertake my service as a facilitator? I'll take this. It talks about a lot about Latine. So you're talking about the Latine culture as well, predominantly Latine parish. And what's beautiful about theology and pastoral care that starts from the person, the reality of the person, is that precisely it allows the weaving in of, right, what we traditionally talk about, intersectionality, right? This idea that we are not just our sexual orientation, right? We have also a culture, etc. In my experience working with Latinx LGBTQ plus persons, there is a process of construction and deconstruction that has to happen. I have a series of articles on the website Outreach on it. There's 2 parts on that about things that have to be constructed and deconstructed in Latinx LGBTQ plus ministry. And one of the biggest things that I've talked about in panels on this is the concept of familia, family, right? And so a good question to ask a group of predominantly Latinx queer persons is, what does family mean to you? And it seems to provide a great foundation for the interactions and the relationships that we're going to create as a Catholic community, as a Latinx Catholic community that really takes family seriously, right? The concept of chosen family is very present in queer circles, but the concept of familia and comunidad are very present in Latine circles. And so there's a cool little reverberation between those two identities that is very important when ministering.
Thank you, Ish. Here's something from Bob, quoting, "As bad as things are, how do we respond to the fact that trends have been small and gradually more favorable? The law has not changed, but there has been pastoral progress."
Do you want to take that one, Bernie?
Yeah, from a non-theologian's perspective, again, it seems to me that, and I think I'm echoing what both Ish and Marianne are saying, in some ways think local, right? That there is progress on local levels and in communities, whether that's in parishes or in other groups that meet as Catholics and, create a faith life and ministry out in the community. So I think pastoral progress is local. I was grateful that Marianne mentioned some of the leads being taken by some German-speaking bishops in Europe, who seem to be finally, there are some people in these Episcopal offices who are taking seriously the lives and loves of queer people, not just as pastoral care of sinners, but as the respecting the lived experience of queer people.
Yeah, celebrate the progress and keep working for even more flowers to grow, right?
Absolutely.
It's both end for me. Yeah.
Agreed. We have a question about resources, and what's interesting is that we are in a cool place, and this connects also to the previous question, is that we're in a cool place where we have these historical groups like Dignity and New Ways Ministry. This is what, late 60s and late 70s, each one of them was founded, right? 69 and 78, I believe. And we have these two groups. We have other groups like Fortunate Families, we have Call to Action, we have other coalitions that have formed, right? Since the publication of this book by James Martin, Building a Bridge, a new type of conversation has also continued. And so now we have this group called Outreach, which is also a very important group. And I think it does, all these groups, they all have different foci and they all have different resources. And I think they all operate differently. And I think, and of course, Pope Francis, his correspondence with James Martin, with Sister Janine Gramick, with Marianne, it speaks really to movement. And so when people are hopeless, I just ask them to pause, take 2 steps back, and look at what has been accomplished in this papacy alone. So hope is very much alive. And I don't think it's foolish hope. I really don't. But I also agree, like, we are the church. And so at the end of the day, no one really takes away that baptism, and no one tells me that I'm not Catholic, or that, that I can live a Catholic life. And so with that, I turn it over to Bernie.
Right, and I want to, Rosa had mentioned earlier, my skeptical nature says that the Vatican perception ultimately is to explain to us what the institution has already decided is Catholicism. True listening doesn't really exist. Thank you for that, Rosa. Thank you, Marianne and Ish, for being a part of this conversation. It was rapid. And of course, we just touched on this topic, but a topic that obviously has an impact upon many of us, many people throughout the world. And maintaining hope is difficult, sometimes seems impossible. But again, finding a community where one can feel supported, where one can be Catholic together and be fully queer is kind of the journey many of us, I think, are on. With that, Mark, would you like to say anything, or how do we close out here?
Sure, well, welcome back on. Thank you so much, Bernie, Ish, and Marianne. I'm impressed with the scope of what you talked about in a short period of time. That was really remarkable. I think there was a lot of information there for folks to hear and to try to digest. Thanks to you as the presenter, as also to everyone here who participated and offered comments. I do want to offer a special thanks to Dignity USA for being a sponsor of tonight's program. You've already heard some about Dignity. Dignity works for respect and justice for people of all sexual orientations, genders, and gender identities, especially gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender persons in the Catholic Church and around the world through education, advocacy, and support. For more than 50 years, Dignity and its chapters around the US have been uniting LGBTQI Catholics. Within a few days, all of you here will receive an email with a link to a recording of tonight's program that you can share with friends and with colleagues. If you are interested in more opportunities to explore the history of queer religious movements, check out the LGBTQ-RAN website and particularly our events page. There you will find announcements of future online programs as well as recording of past presentations. Our next program on Thursday evening, June 13th, will feature Reverend Dr. Jim Matulski interviewing political scientist Royal G. Cravens on his newly published book, Yes, God, How Faith Shapes LGBTQ Identity and Politics. You can sign up now to join this Zoom webinar. Again, it's on June 13th. I remind you that if you would like to offer personal greetings or comments to the presenters, remain here and you will be invited into the Zoom room with them. On behalf of everyone here, I offer much gratitude to Bernie, Marianne, and Ish for their enlightening conversation. Good night to all.